Okay, so overpayments can be recovered under certain circumstances, but only if the overpayment is due to a mathematical or other clerical error by the employer. Couple important things here. First of all, the error has to be by the employee. If you've overpaid someone because they claim to have worked more hours than they actually did, then these overpayment requirement or regulations are not relevant. In that case, honestly, you could not make a deduction. You would have to pursue other means. You may be able to discipline or fire the employee for falsifying their time record, and you might even be able to sue the employee to recover the money, but you could not take it out of their pay. It also has to be due to a mathematical or other clerical error. What exactly qualifies as a clerical error could get dicey in some situations. There's no elaboration on that in the regulations, but it is clear enough that if you just said, well, we're going to pay you for 40 hours this week because we don't know how much money or how many hours you actually worked, and then down the road the company decide, oh, now we think that you worked 20 hours and we need to get that $20 back, that's probably going to be a problem. What's really intended here, and I put this old-fashioned sort of ledger sheet in this picture. Maybe it was easier to make clerical errors when it was done by paper and pencil. Now with computers, hopefully at least the math is being done correctly. The bigger problem is probably with the data entry. So, any of those types of mistakes where somebody added 10 hours on Tuesday and 8 hours on Wednesday and came up with 16 hours, that's a mathematical error. A clerical error would include the data entry errors where we just forgot to move one pay or one day into vacation or something like that, even though we had the record to know we should have. So again, there's no finite scope of what that includes, but there is kind of a general understanding of what it doesn't include. We're going to go into more detail, but there are limitations on the timing and amounts of recovering overpayments. And you do have to formally create a notice and dispute procedure and give notice of that to the employee in connection with making these overpayments, and then follow that procedure in ways we'll discuss. And if you do satisfy all of the requirements, you can accomplish the recovering of the overpayment either by a wage deduction or a separate transaction. So it gets a little complicated to explain why that's relevant. So again, primarily we're talking about what are you taking out of wage payment, but as I mentioned before, you could in most cases ask someone to voluntarily pay the company back. Here is a situation where if you follow all of these details, arguably you could actually take disciplinary action, fire someone, or let them know that you're going to if they don't pay you back by separate transaction. I'm not really familiar with situations where it happened that way, but I think the regulations leave that as an open possibility. It's normally the only situation where you wouldn't be taking it from future wages is where there aren't future wages, in which case threatening to fire someone if they don't pay you back the money may be irrelevant, as they're already not working there any longer for whatever reason. Okay, so on this slide, it kind of summarized the timing, duration, and frequency limitations. First of all, you can only go back 8 weeks before notice of overpayment to an employee. So what this means is if you discover a mathematical or clerical error that took place 6 months ago, it's too late to use this process. Again, maybe you could say, hey, we realize we paid you more than we should. Would you mind paying that back? But you couldn't fire them if they say no. It's 8 weeks before the notice. So if you find this out and it's literally been 7 weeks and 4 days since the payday where this money was improperly paid to the employee, you better hurry fast to give them notice of the overpayment. If it's 8 weeks and a day, then you're stuck. What I have seen happen is situation where someone was repeatedly overpaid, even arguably in that case based on a clerical or mathematical error, and the overpayment started more than 8 weeks ago but continued within the 8 week span. So in that case, you'd be able to go back the 8 weeks, but you couldn't go back further. So once you identify how much overpayment and make sure it's within 8 weeks, then you can recover that amount through deductions lasting up to 6 years from the overpayment itself. So most of you are probably thinking, why would I ever want to wait 6 years to recover all the money? Do we have to spread it out over 6 years? No, in most cases you wouldn't have to, but there might be a scenario where it could take that long. I mean, imagine somebody who works part-time and makes so little money that it will take them 6 years to even earn the amount they were overpaid. Then, I guess it could push that, but in most cases it's not going to take that long to make the deduction. And we're going to talk about some actual limits on how much each deduction can be on the next slide. The other thing, just because the regulations mention it, it's not critically important to keep in mind, I don't think, but it's kind of intuitive. There's no more than one deduction per wage payment. So you can't say, well, we're going to deduct this through a series of $50 deductions over the next 6 pays, and then for some reason say, well, this week we're going to take 2 deductions instead of 1. Whatever you can do, you figure it out on a per wage period or per payday basis and take it on each payday. Okay, so what amount of deductions can be made? There's a couple important distinctions here. The first is that you can recover it in full on as soon as the next payment, but only in a situation where the overpayment amount is less than what the employee will make in the next payroll. So if they were accidentally paid an extra $100 that you can recover, and they normally make $600 a pay period, then you could take the full $100 out of the paycheck. One note that this does have to be net of other deductions, so you can't take away more than the full amount of the check. So once the taxes come out and any health insurance contributions and whatever, you can't run the check negative. Otherwise, your recovery in any given payroll cannot exceed 12.5% of the gross wages in the payroll. Now, this would be gross wages before the deductions. So if someone makes a salary of $600 a week and you need to deduct $1,000, for example, then you can't deduct the $1,000 on the next payroll. You have to spread it out, and the most you could deduct in any given payroll is 12.5% of the $600. So say $75 per week. So to get the $1,000, it is going to take you 3 or 4 months to get that money back. Again, 3 or 4 months, a lot less than 6 years, but if there was enough money overpaid and the person does make enough, a little enough money, then it could take a while to recover it. The other thing is that in any given payroll, this deduction can't reduce the employee's pay below minimum wage. So whatever the operative minimum wage would work out to be per hour, the deduction, even at 12.5% of their gross wages, couldn't also reduce them below the effective minimum wage. I'm not going to try to do that math because it's not worth the time and the confusion, but note that that is an important parameter. So when you give the notice to the employee, you have to state the total amount that you believe was overpaid on a total and per pay period basis. So if it was a one-time thing, say we took out an extra, or we gave you an extra $800 on this payday, or if it was over 4 payrolls, then this is how much from each of the respective pay periods we paid you more than we should have. You have to include a schedule of deductions. The schedule of deductions is probably the best you can do. You may not be able to do the exact dollar amount because of the 12% and minimum wage limitations. So keep that in mind. You also have to give in this notice an explanation of the procedure for disputing the deductions, giving the employee a chance to say, wait, I don't think you should have taken this money out. And we'll go into more detail on that. And then you have to notify the employee that they either have 3 days or 3 weeks before the deductions could begin. The 3 days applies in the case where you're going to be making the full recovery in the next pay period, so where it's a relatively little amount compared to the employee's pay, less than their take-home pay. You only have to give them 3 days notice. Otherwise, you have to give them at least 3 weeks notice before the series of deductions begins. What does the dispute procedure have to look like? Well, to kind of simplify it for summary purposes, the employee has a week to respond to the notice. The caveat on that would be that in the case where you're going to deduct in the next payday, on the next payday, and you've told them they only have 3, or you're going to start deducting in 3 days, they have 2 days to dispute it, which for some of you will be problematic anyway because your payroll is run more than 1 day in advance. So I would just say, even if you're going to do it the next payroll, you don't have to, unless you're really up against that 8-week limitation, give the notice so your next payroll is not 3 days or less away. Employer will then have, if the employee says I'm disputing the deduction, the employer has a week to respond to the dispute in writing, after which the employee has a week to say, I want to meet with management to discuss the situation. And then a week after that, the employer has to issue the final determination. So the law does give the company the right to make the final call on whether or not the overpayment was made and the deduction is appropriate. So at that point, you can then proceed to make the deduction, but you still have to wait another 3 weeks after the final determination for the deduction to be made. I presume that would be to give the employee time to go to the Department of Labor or an attorney to try to more formally dispute the company's position. If the company has followed the procedure appropriately and given all the right notices and calculated everything, well, then you should be okay with the Department of Labor or whatever other remedy the employee might seek. If you have not followed this procedure properly, then the Department of Labor is going to just presume that there was no overpayment and there can be no deduction. So important to do this right, or else you may lose the ability to recover the money.